Good morning. Let us gather ourselves in the presence of God. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, by whose Spirit the whole body of your faithful people is governed and sanctified, receive our supplications and prayers which we offer before you for all members of your holy church, that in their vocation and ministry they may truly and devoutly serve you. Through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Dios Todopoderoso y Eterno, cuyo Espíritu gobierna y santifica a todo el cuerpo de tu pueblo fiel, recibe las súplicas y oraciones que te ofrecemos por todos los miembros de tu Santa Iglesia, para que en su vocación y ministerio te sirvan verdadera y devotamente, por nuestro Señor y Salvador Jesucristo, que vive y reina contigo en la unidad del Espíritu Santo, un solo Dios, ahora y por siempre. Amén.
Amen. And thank you so much for joining us this morning here at the Once and Future Third Place. My name is Adam McDonald. I am the Director of Development at St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue, and I also serve on the planning committee for the SEEP conference. So if you have any questions, I probably don't know the answer, but I can get you to the right place. I am really excited to share this discussion with you, and I'm going to do a quick intro and get out of the way. We're joined today by Casper ter Kuile and Mary Gray Reeves. Casper is the author of The Power of Ritual. He has two podcasts, Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, and The Real Question. That one just started. It's quite good, so I encourage you to check it out. He's a ministry fellow at Harvard Divinity and the co-founder of the Sacred Design Lab. Mary Gray Reeves is the former bishop of the Diocese of El Camino Real. She is currently managing director of the College for Bishops. She is author of Unearthing My Religion and co-author of Hospitality for God. And you probably know her from the beautiful Authority Network, which supports women in ordained ministry. Folks, I'm going to say goodbye. If you need anything or have any questions, please find me on the Whova app. And I just want to say that these two are the kind of folks that you want to have as friends, you want to share a meal with, and you'd love to work on a project together. So thank you, Casper and Mary, and have a great session together.
Thank you so much, Adam. Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see everyone entering into this this digital space. I so appreciate your warm invitation, and I'm so looking forward to having this conversation with Mary. Mary, if you're willing, I will kick us off with just a little presentation to offer some provocations as we get started, and we'll be learning from you straight after that. So I will go ahead and share my screen and trust that you will tell me if there's any issues in it showing up. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. Mary and I will have a conversation for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll have a little exercise for you that will stimulate some conversation as well. So don't worry, it's not going to be all slides, but I hope this will be stimulating. I want to situate this conversation about third spaces, about the evolution of religious community in America, just within some trends, so that we're all on the same page. We're not going to argue about these. We're not going to talk in depth about them. But I just want to set the same foundation for us all to have a productive conversation. So the first thing you, of course, already know is that there is a very, very rapid disaffiliation from institutional religion along generational lines. So here you'll see on the right-hand side of this graph, the rate of disaffiliation for older generations, and on the left-hand side, the rate of disaffiliation for younger people. And for millennials, my generation, that rate is now just about at 40%. And we expect that number to even probably go a little higher for Gen Z, so folks who are just leaving home now. So it is a stark and a rapid shift. But I promise you, I'm not going to tell the usual story here, so just stay with me. Of course, that impacts enormously institutions of religious community. You know, the guess is that the average number of churches that close every year is somewhere around 3,500. But it's not just in a Christian context. In a Jewish context, 70% of non-Orthodox Jews are marrying outside the faith, which has opened a large number of questions, at least over the last 20 years, about intermarriage, for example, in the Jewish context, and questions of continuity. But more broadly, it's not just about trust in religious institutions and the willingness to affiliate with religious institutions. This is a much broader story about trust in institutions declining in government, in media, even in science. Please God, that changes with the success of these vaccines. But nonetheless, we're seeing a growing chasm between people's individual lives and their institutional affiliation. So for example, you might look at, you know, the average 22-year-old and say, well, they're much more likely to trust someone they follow, an individual they follow on Instagram, rather than an institution that they want to affiliate with. And we can unpack that a little bit more, but that's one of the key trends that's pushing this disaffiliation. All of that has an enormous impact in how people who are unaffiliated experience their sense of spirituality. One of the biggest misnomers in this conversation is that everyone who doesn't go to church is somehow a hardened atheist. That is far from true. 2 out of 3 people still believe in God or a higher power. And most strikingly, 1 in 5 even still pray every day. This is all data from the Pew studies. So rather than this kind of very binary, well, you're either in church or you're not religious, there's a much more interesting kind of gray area in which we might describe people as spiritually without a home. So there's a sense of people wanting a spiritual life, but not having a place to go for it. Now, as that disaffiliation trend has risen, so too has the trend on isolation and loneliness. Social isolation being the structural ways in which we're spending more time alone by perhaps you know, more people living alone, people working from home. Obviously, this year has seen a huge surge in that, but also, you know, rates of people who are separated or divorced, for example, marrying later. So people literally spending more time on their own. Loneliness is the experience of not having the quality of relationship that you want to. So you can feel lonely even though you're surrounded by other people, because the type of feeling that you're having isn't the one that you want to have. You're not feeling as connected as you want to. So both social isolation and loneliness have been rising at the same time as we've seen this disaffiliation. What strikes me is that 1 in 4 Americans, so they have nobody to talk to about the things that are most important to them. That includes family members and a spouse. And 1 in 5 say they have only one person. So this experience of sort of a cosmic loneliness or a place of feeling not at home in the world is prevalent. At the same time, we're seeing climbing rates of stress, anxiety, depression. I'm afraid to say suicide rates are at a 30-year high. And there's been a fascinating amount of research in the public health world around the impact of loneliness on life expectancy. So much so that it now is equal to being clinically obese or smoking 15 cigarettes a day in terms of the impact on our mortality. Now that shows up in all sorts of ways. One that surprised me was that it takes on average 4 people to tell us to go get that thing checked out at the doctor, you know, the thing that you don't want to get checked out. And so if we don't have relationships where people are telling us to get that thing checked out, the rates of discovery for breast cancer, for example, are much slower for people who are socially isolated. So that's just one way in which some of this kind of this social fabric breaking down is having an impact on our physical health, let alone to talk about politics, which I'll leave for another day. So I just want to situate this conversation in those trends because I think they're related. And I want to introduce to you a little bit of a landscape that's been inspiring to me in the face of that disaffiliation trend and that trend towards social isolation. And my hope is that it actually presents an invitation for religious institutions to look at this new life and find ways to be part of it and to contribute to it. So here is the key idea that I want to kind of provoke you with, which is that the distribution systems we have for meaning, for purpose, for community are becoming obsolete for younger generations. They don't have the cultural resonance, the strength of invitation that they once did. But here's the key. The longing that people have for community, for meaning making, for purpose, for singing together, for experiences of transcendence, for contributing to justice, that is as strong as ever. So if I can be very crude and say that the content of religious community is as important and valuable and exciting as ever, and I'll prove to you how, it is the way in which we've structured it. It's the distribution system. That's where the problem lies. And I want to talk you through just 3 ways that we talk about what some of those, the goodness of religious community is all about, using language that can speak out into a broadly secular world. So there's 3 things that we say that the soul longs for, and I'll trust your forgiveness if this doesn't resonate, but here's how we talk about it at Sacred Design Lab. The first thing is that we want belonging. We need belonging. This word is everywhere at the moment, and thank goodness. We talk about it as having the experience of being fully known and fully loved. That sense that if you're there, someone notices, and if you're not there, someone asks you why you weren't able to come. That sense of intimacy and familiarity, but also that sense of belonging to place, to a history, to a people, that it's a multi-layered experience. It's not just social, it has these other dimensionalities to it. So that's one of the things that people long for, that is still as true as ever, even though they might not be finding it at church. The second one is this experience of becoming. I'm so grateful to Michelle Obama for her book title carrying this name, because the word is kind of coming back into our popular discourse. And it's important for us to situate this as slightly different from a kind of self-improvement, the ever, continuing treadmill of capitalist thinking, which says that, we have to be better or faster or stronger. Becoming is something which is much more about the capacity of ourselves to say yes to the invitation from life. That sense that we're growing, not just our virtues, but our ability to receive the invitation of what life offers us. And we never stop becoming. I will cede to Mary to give us a much better definition when it comes to it, but that's how we like to talk about it. So we've got belonging, becoming, and then finally this experience of connecting with something beyond yourself. This is really about experiencing ourselves as something more. That feeling of being fully big, as part of the universe, but also just as small as a grain of sand. That sense of that we fit somehow into something bigger. And you hear people use this language, within kind of ecosystems or the natural world. Some people might use a cosmological language or astrological language, but you're seeing this theme, of course, show up very prominently within theology, but also in these other spaces. So I offer you those 3 words of belonging, becoming, beyond. Just look for them as I talk through some of these case studies of new third spaces, because I think they will resonate and illustrate the ways in which people who are not religious are still seeking out religious-like things, but it's happening in new places. So let's look at some of these stories, because I think this is where it comes to life. My work at Harvard Divinity School with my colleague Angie Thurston really started with the question, where do people like me, who are not affiliated, I didn't grow up in a religious tradition, even though I grew up in England and was, of course, influenced by the Anglican tradition, one can't help that in the UK. But for someone like me who isn't religious in that formal way, where are people like me going to find community, meaning, and purpose? And this one place came back over and over again, which we documented here in this little report called How We Gather, was CrossFit. Now, for those of you familiar with CrossFit, you will know that this is a fitness community, and it was really on the leading edge of these kind of boutique fitness groups that are not just about a gym that has machines and weights and you do your own thing. These are classes that people do together. And it's not just a class where you might kind of silently not engage with other people as you're working out. It really tries to build a community. So after the workouts are done on Friday, people will come over to drink beers, for example, or they might not just get fit in the gym, but they also compete at the CrossFit Games, where people travel every summer to compete against all the other local CrossFit boxes, the gyms as they're known. They name specific workouts after servicemen and women who've died in the line of service. So it has a very strong military and veteran culture. So you have this kind of interesting experience of workouts memorializing the dead. And of course, it has a whole kind of dietary culture built around the fitness regime of the paleo diet. So you're starting to see the way in which a community starts to identify itself, not just by the workouts it does together, but by the food it eats and doesn't eat, which I hope reminds you of halakha, of Jewish dietary laws and other religious traditions that make kind of boundaries around food consumption. So as we looked at these communities, we started to see it through a religious lens. People approached their fitness instructors asking them, should I divorce my husband? People raised money for members of the community who were struggling with healthcare bills. We saw so many examples of these fitness communities doing way more than just health and fitness, but really becoming the locus of community and meaning in the lives of their members. Interestingly, when COVID hit, something like, I think the data was, and this was 2 or 3 months after the beginning of COVID, so it's a little out of date now, but 95% of the members were still paying relatively high fees, even though they weren't actually using the space or the facilities, because they felt that this was their community, that they had a responsibility to it. So it was not just a consumer interaction, there was something much, much deeper. Of course, the funniest thing to say about CrossFit is, and I should take aim at Harvard here as well, but how do you know if someone is vegan, goes to Harvard, or does CrossFit? They tell you. So there's this very strong kind of evangelical culture of CrossFit has changed my life and I want you to change your life with CrossFit too. That's very, very much built into the culture. So much so that if you want to open a CrossFit gym, you don't just have to, write an application and demonstrate some business savvy or kind of coaching skills. What they're really looking for is, what is your kind of evangelical capacity to talk about your experience with CrossFit and recruit others with this same kind of social technology. So I'm just illustrating here some of the resonances that we found in this particular community. Which kept reminding us of some of these religious echoes. But I want to give you one other example that's very different. The dinner party, which was another case study in our report, is a community of people, mostly in their 20s and 30s, who have experienced significant loss. So it might be the death of a parent, a sibling, a loved one, at a relatively young age. And for a lot of those people, the experience is that they can't really talk about it with anyone. Lennon Flowers, who's one of the co-founders, described the experience of Mother's Day coming around and someone asking, oh, did you call your mom or whatever? She was like, no, she died a couple of years ago. It was a conversation killer. Like, people didn't know what to do with it. So she just longed to be with other people who shared a similar experience, and did what anyone does when you're going to get people together. She started a potluck, and with the explicit invitation to talk about life after loss. And so, that welcomed the sadness and the grief, sometimes the relief or the anger, the joy, and not just in that initial period of intense grief, but really for lifelong after that experience of loss. And so these communities started popping up. People hosted it in their own homes. People would bring a dish and contribute to the table, and they would have an explicit conversation about their life after loss. So for us, looking again with these kind of religious lenses, we started to see examples of spiritual accompaniment, of small groups forming, because often this wasn't just a one-time thing. These groups would meet every month, for years. The ritual sharing of food, the memorializing of the dead. And of course, Lennon and others who took leadership in this community suddenly were not just, organizing spreadsheets and helping to match people in the same city. When one of their hosts, their table hosts, very sadly took their own life, it had this huge kind of trauma response from the entire leadership community. And so they found themselves really providing pastoral care in a way that they had not expected to. So this is a trend that we're seeing constantly in these new communities, is that people think they're signing up to be a fitness instructor or to be a convener of conversations about death, but often they very quickly end up having to explore what it means to live in a world with suffering. What do you do when someone who you love takes their own life? What happens when there's a sexual assault in the community, right? All of these things are real, just as they are in congregations, and so they are in these communities. So there is an extreme kind of extra burden of pastoral leadership placed on these civic leaders in these third spaces that they did not expect. And I think large congregations can help. More on that later. The other lovely thing is the civic engagement. This is something we've seen over and over again. Communities will gather for one reason, and in this case, it was to gather in conversations about grief. But after the 2016 election, they felt so moved and challenged by the result of that election. They said, we have to find a different way to have a conversation in this country. And so together with two other organizations, the Dinner Party co-founded the People's Supper, which was an invitation for Republicans, Democrats, or wherever people landed to gather over dinner and to have a conversation as people first, to build a relationship over food before they talked about politics. So that pattern is consistent, that they might start with one reason, but then they're in the world and they feel pulled to offer the gifts that they have to the world around them. So you'll see a little bit of that in this final case study, which I wanted to include. It's a podcast that I co-host called Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, where what we do is we read the Harry Potter books one chapter at a time, but we use traditional sacred reading practices. So drawing on the Jewish and the Christian textual traditions, we do things like Chavruta, Lectio Divina, Pardes, and various other textual practices, not with the traditional sacred texts, but with Harry Potter. And of course, there are millions and millions of readers of these books who are already turning to the Harry Potter books as a sacred text, whether it's after the breakup with a boyfriend, maybe in a ritual way at the beginning of the new calendar year. These texts are so generative in terms of fan art and musicals and all sorts of theme parks, even all sorts of things, that we saw there was a kind of aliveness to this book that and the people who read it, that we were excited to have a chance to read them sacredly. And what has happened that's so exciting for us is not just that large numbers of people listen to the podcast and do sacred text study by themselves or on the phone with their sister-in-law, or they adapt it for the classroom, but that we saw people starting to form local communities around the podcast. So there's more than 100 local groups now who gather regularly, of course it all happens on Zoom now, to talk about the text and their own lives. And that's what I love so much about this practice, is it's a mirror, right? The text is a mirror that helps us understand who we are and whose we are and how to live. It's not an instruction manual, it's a mirror in which we get to understand our own lives. We then started hosting pilgrimages. So we would bring people together over 4 days to do that deep reading, but also to walk, to share silence, to share other spiritual practices. And these communities just kept forming deeper and deeper. Every year we'd raise money for things like Black Lives Matter or immigration justice. And at the beginning of COVID, and this is maybe the thing I'm most proud of, the community self-organized to form a mutual aid network of podcast listeners. So people were sending money to each other, sending art to one another, getting on the phone to listen if someone was feeling lonely to their stories. So I illustrate these as examples of third spaces that I think carry some of the wisdom and beauty of religious communities, even though they ostensibly are doing it in a secular way. So there's an entire landscape of these organizations, other fitness groups, there's adult summer camps, there's apps that get people together, volunteering organizations, all sorts of organizations that, again, are ostensibly secular, but when you look deeper, you start to see how they're meeting those needs of belonging, becoming, and beyond. And in our work, we've been gathering leaders of those communities over the last few years and learning about what they're, what they do really well, which is about speaking into the culture as it is, finding ways of inviting people into relationships of commitment and depth, finding ways to bring kind of spiritual practices into the world. But what they struggle with is, a lot of the things that the institutional church does really well. How do you make decisions when you start as one community and suddenly there's 300 of you? How do you form leaders and support leaders once they're in leadership? What do you do about founder burnout? How do you handle crises, whether they're financial or ethical? All of these conversations happen in these communities just like they do in the church. And there's a potential for collaboration there. So my provocation is this, and then I'm very excited to hear from Mary. I think it will be very, very difficult for existing religious communities, for large congregations, to create a whole new community that lives in this kind of different paradigm. The language is so different, the norms are different, it is a different world. But there is something very powerful that you can do in coming alongside these new communities and giving the gifts that you have to give to help them become the most faithful, the most ethical, the most beautiful form that they can be, so that we move into a sort of a mixed ecology of religious and spiritual communities. I'm using Lisa Greenwood's language there. But that is, I think, the offer that I want to put on the table. Not that you have to radically change what you're doing for you. That's working for you, and that's wonderful. But it's very difficult to keep doing what you're doing and attract these new people. And I don't think you have to. I think it's much better to support them in creating what they're creating, but offering the gifts that you have to give. And we can talk more about what those gifts are if you're feeling anxious, but I hope you're not. So my question for you is, how might you map your neighborhood? Where are these communities showing up literally in your physical location, on the couple of blocks around your church building? Where are these communities living? And how might you accompany those leaders? So much more to say, but I will pause there and look forward so much to this conversation with Mary and then with all of you.
Great, thank you. Is that my lead in to ask questions and start? So yeah, that was great. And I commend Casper's book to you, just to think more deeply about these things. Some of his language in the introduction that I really liked included things like composting old rituals, unbundling things, pulling stuff apart, saying what's the essence of this versus the, what is the content versus the form. And as Episcopalians, as Anglicans, we love our form. It just melts our hearts in particular, but it doesn't do that for everybody. And so it's important for us to really say, what is the essence here that all human beings need, and that form can change as the needs are met with the most essential things of the human divine connecting experience, the human to human experience. Remixing and braiding, I liked that word braiding in the sense of how things might weave together, and they form their own third space. I think as you just said, to offer gifts into those third spaces, but I would want to say as a church leader to let those third spaces offer gifts into the church, so that there is a braiding there. I think in our reality as Episcopalians, because we love our form and our ritual as it often has existed for, we think forever, but reality is our rituals have changed over time. That's part of our reality. But we often look to the institution to do things for us. And I think one of the things you can help us here is that it is in the practices and the rituals that happen outside of the contained spaces, where we then learn how to participate and be present with the essential things that all humans need and require. And we're not always very good at that as Episcopalians. It's a place of practice for us, for sure. So I'll give it back to you, and then I have a couple questions about as a churchy person, as a Christ follower.
Beautiful. Well, I just want to emphasize some of the things you said, Mary. I love that. It's such a good reminder that every tradition was once an innovation. I find it gives such spiritual agency, if I can use that word, that sense that we too might be creators of tradition in some way, and that our response, I think often of Carol Zinn, who's the executive director of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, the largest grouping of American Catholic sisters. She always says that religious life has to be a radical response to the gospel in a specific historical and cultural context. So it's that conversation between the ancient and the emergent in which the most kind of life-giving religious forms emerge. And I really want to point to what you said, that it is often, in this moment at least, the practices that have most resonance across those boundaries of secular or religious. That, we're doing text study with people who are, non-binary atheists who have all sorts of feelings about institutional religion, but they love talking about text and meaning in their lives and what it's all about and why we're here. And we're using the practices of Lectio Divina, but we're just giving it a different way in. And so this is not about a radical kind of throwing everything out, not at all. It's about finding what is essential and what is resonant in this moment, that can help people engage with these questions and a life of justice, service, and beauty. And for me, that's what's so exciting, because I mean, this is a little silly way of saying it, but we don't have to try too hard. People already want to find what the kind of things that we have to offer, but it's approaching it in a different way. It's letting go of some of our assumptions, and it's saying what isn't what isn't necessary, what is just the essential that we can share. And I find that very creatively stimulating, as you can see.
I think too, in my own in writing The Hospitality of God, first of all, we tend to sort of relegate some of these more innovative, but we elevate these innovative communities in the church off to the edge. But I want to say that's where the creativity is right now, that the questions that the broad church is asking, they're out there figuring it out. So you don't institutionalize them, but go hang out there and see what you can learn. But I found that those clergy or lay leaders in those communities were excellent liturgists. So they understood the history of liturgy, they understood the intent of liturgy, and they were able to compost, to braid, to reimagine liturgies that made sense in their context. I also want to back up as I've been pondering all of this, and in my own conversations with people, because I try not to spend all my time in the church, because there's just so much, there's a world out there, right? And as our world declines, it's like there's more conversations to be had. And I in my own conversations discover that many people have not even thought about the concept of ritual in their lives. So to say,
absolutely,
what is a ritual for you? And to say it's pizza on Friday night, or well, we hold hands at the dinner table and we have gratitude or whatever. I mean, these are rituals. So to just call that formula to mind as a practice that actually centers people, which is simply a spiritual dynamic within every human being, or an emotional dynamic, whatever language you want to call it. There is a centering capacity that gets you to be present in the power of ritual. The other piece that I have, you and I talked in our pre-conversations about Soul Cycle, and having done Cycle Bar for a while, there were times when we get to the meditation point, I just like, you keep spinning, give me that microphone, because it's just like, it was for me funny, of course, but I kept on did my own workout in that. But the thing about faith traditions is that not only are these is it a place to be formed in the basics of the belonging and the becoming and the beyond, right? So those rituals are going to keep opening up the human and the human community into something much bigger than themselves, that we would want to say eternal and infinite in our faith tradition. And that's one thing that I know these communities probably struggle with, is then what's the greater purpose actually when those basic needs are met, what's happening? And I'd want to say, as a person of the Christian faith, that one of the ridiculous things about Christianity is that we hope in the fullness of reconciliation, and I will jokingly say, Jesus, today's a good day to come, right? This past year, like, how's great? Let's get this on with this, right? Because we hope in that fullness of God's dream and vision and justice for the world, and so we push to that. A Reformed Jewish rabbi I read said, the promised land, it doesn't matter if it's real. It matters that you're always moving towards it, right? It's the journey of that bigger thing. And that's one thing that I ponder in some of these third spaces, is what is their intentionality around justice and around the fullness of redemption. Some of these places are financially off the chart, they're just not accessible for some people. There's going to be racial dynamics in that, cultural barriers and preclusions for that, and that those are things for the church that we need to be attentive to and careful about as we ponder third spaces, because we come not with a moralistic, hopefully, way of being, and but we come with values, and we come with We come with things that we believe God cares deeply about, and we cannot, I'm not sure it's helpful to us to trade that off in order to be in those third spaces. So I just offer that as something that I think, you know, the amazing thing about God and that we know in Jesus is that God gives God's self fully away and is still God's self, right? So as we believe we are made in the image of Christ, as we believe we are to live into that image, we are fully ourselves, and yet we give ourselves fully away. And how do we do that paradox, right?
It's so important, Mary, and within what you're saying is such an exciting proposition, I think, which is that, again, that the church at least knows better how to do some of these things than a lot of these communities, because what happens over and over again is that how these communities form is that one person feels that they want something, they can't find it, and so they start it. And then either it, you know, stays small, continues, and it closes in a while, or it balloons and suddenly it's this enormous organization, and they've never thought about some of these challenges. And you know, a maker space in Somerville, Massachusetts is a good example here. You know, this was a space in which there were all sorts of machines and tools in which people could do everything from welding to jewelry making, woodwork, laser cut technologies, you know, what 3D printing, all of this kind of fabulous maker stuff. And they decided to be open for 24 hours a day. And so what they started to notice was that people weren't just coming to use the tools, you know, during normal working hours or evenings and weekends. People were coming at 2 or 3 a.m. And these folks had often had moments of crisis. They were looking to self-harm, or they were trying to stay sober. So suddenly a whole different context for that community started to emerge. And they started to realize that there were various systemic forces that were impacting the people in and just beyond the community. And so suddenly they started getting involved in housing justice campaigns, in you know, addiction and recovery work. And so exactly like what you're saying, it's not an intentionality that starts those journeys often. It's an encounter with the real world. And then suddenly a question of like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And often people don't know where to go or how to do it. So that's another opportunity where I think congregations could offer really great help. And I long for the day, you know, I spent 7 years in Boston where we have GBIO, the interfaith organizing network that works on systemic justice issues in the greater Boston area. And these networks are, of course, everywhere around the country. I would love to see some of these ostensibly secular organizations be pulled into that kind of power mapping and mobilization around various justice issues in that community. So I think there's, you know, beyond just the community building opportunities, there's real impact to be made. I want to come back to one other, oh, go ahead, sorry.
I just want to add to that, because I think that's another critique for us as the church, is that we often want to do everything ourselves. Right. So we want to create our own networks that are just ours. And I want to really affirm what you just said about community organizing and about partnering with people who are already doing, you know, the work of recovery has been done and doing beautifully, and in the basements of Episcopal churches through recovery groups. There are many organizations with which we can partner, and we do not have to invent everything in order to accomplish God's dream in the world.
And nor do we have to let go of the things that we do best, because I love that you honed in on ritual, because I you know, I hope everyone knows this, but ritual is having a moment. Ritual is hot right now, especially since the beginning of the pandemic. You know, there were all sorts of conversations of, wow, our lives have been muddled and completely unraveled. How do we find, you know, our own sense of center, but also a sort of a rhythm in time? Well, hello, ritual. Hello, the daily walk around the neighborhood. And you now have even a growing number of organizations that offer ritual consultancy, even in the corporate sphere, because more and more companies are trying to help their employees figure out, you know, how to actually end the workday. People are working more than they did before the pandemic, absurdly. So ritual as a yearning that people are looking for this consciously is growing. And we had such a pleasure of hosting our mutual friend, the former bishop in Chicago, Jeff Lee, hosted us with a group of Episcopal liturgists and then a group of secular experience designers, people who, create experiences at Disneyland, or people who are choreographing dance, or people who are hosting, early morning sober raves. All of these really interesting experiences that are now everywhere were actually drawing on the very kind of tradition and wisdom, without knowing it, of liturgical design. And it was such a thrilling conversation, because here were these secular folks being like, wow, there's a whole discipline called liturgical studies. Like, you think about this? Oh my God, tell me everything you know. What was the catechumenate? Just fabulous conversations. But here was the other thing. You had people who are, the ritual or the liturgist leads at cathedrals and large congregations around the country saying, gosh, we have often thought about liturgy as a place of security and safety. And here you are talking, experience designers, that essential to experience design is risk. What would it look like for us to think about bringing risk into our liturgy? So for me, the joy is in those conversations where people are building on one another's gifts. And that starts by being in relationship together. So for me, that's so much of the invitation, as you said, is to go out and find where people are doing these things and build those relationships of trust, so that you can collaborate, whether it's community organizing, ritual design, or something else.
Great. I think we're just at time to make a shift here. Is that okay, Casper?
Let's do it.
Okay, so we're going to do a little exercise called a question burst. And if you want to learn more about how to ask great questions, I'll give MIT a plug, but in their online continuing ed, there's a course called Leadership Through Inquiry, and the question burst is one of the tools that we learned in the course. So I've never done it with 98 people, and I've never done it on Zoom in chat, but let's do a little risk, right? So we're going to have a sort of a ritual moment that we all contribute to and can learn together about what we're pondering. So the question burst is when you take problem or a challenge, and I'm intentionally not masquerading that word as opportunity, but to just say, this is a problem and a challenge, right? We have not been able to answer this question, right? So what we want to do in this is I'm going to propose that in just a moment. And then the intention is to write in the chat only questions. You may not respond to the questions. You may not answer your own question. You may only ask the questions. And the intent is to ask questions not about that are sort of blame or deterministic in their thinking, but questions that open up, that are invitational, that are non-aggressive, and that intrigue the imagination. So we're not going to answer the questions. Hopefully what we're going to do is give you all the questions from the chat, so that will be emailed to you later. And then you'll find some that will jump out that really are the ones that are sparking for you to help open your imagination and your creativity around this whole topic. So it's for 4 minutes, we're gonna just record everybody's questions. So just take a moment to sort of check in with yourself, even just about how you think about questions, right? What does that word even just do for you? Do you suddenly say, I have to know the answer? If I ask a question, I actually have to know the answer before I ask the question, right? So sometimes we're framed in education, our educational system is actually not interested that much in questions, it's interested in answers. And I'm asking you to, in fact, be interested in questions. So here's the challenge, which is really what we've been talking about. It is geared towards the church, towards the group that is gathered here today, and the reasons that you've come. The problem or the challenge for our historic institution is that it does not always know how to generate willingness and energy to think creatively about how we share the good news of Jesus Christ in ways that are relevant for people in today's culture. I'm going to type it in the chat, but I'm going to say it one more time. The problem or challenge, and you don't have to agree with me about this, okay? So we're not actually going to discuss the challenge that I'm giving you. I'm just giving it to you, and you can do with it what you like. The problem or the challenge for our historic institution is that it does not always know how to generate willingness and energy to think creatively about how we could share the good news of Jesus Christ in ways that are relevant for people in today's culture. So I'll type that in the chat and I will let you know when our 4 minutes is up. So enjoy creating your questions.
Great, seeing the first questions arrive already. Please do share them in the chat. I love this one from Anne. What is church? Mike, how do we open up lines of communication with younger generations? John, what are we afraid of losing? Beautiful. Elizabeth, how do we make space for the work that creativity requires when we're so bogged down with all the pieces we feel like we need to offer? How to risk letting go?
I'm just going to post the question in case anybody needs to read it again.
Oh, Amy, excellent. How do we stop being jealous of these other churches? These are great questions, y'all. Fantastic. Josh, how do we leverage our financial resources to promote the idea of a mixed ecology? Melinda, I love that. What gifts can older members of my congregation share with those outside our church community? Love that. Beautiful, Bowie. How do we use our outdoor spaces to connect with nature lovers? Love that. I'm so glad we're saving these, Mary. These are so great.
Great exercise.
Beautiful. I don't know if you're having the same experience, but one of the things I love about what you've offered us, Mary, is the insistence on the questions and not answering them. Because at least for me, I'm seeing questions build on questions, right? We're seeing new questions emerge from previous questions. And even in my mind, I'm thinking new ones. So I just love this.
Busy reading them. So.
Yes, Jacqueline, how do we navigate our own structures, bishops who both protect and restrain us? Yeah, this offers all sorts of juicy questions.
I'll take that one.
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you, everybody. Let's just sit for about 10 seconds in silence as we let our words drop in. Actually, I'll say one thing, and then Casper, you can move into ones that are attractive to you too. But that business about a bishop. So the institution actually, I think, needs to have a conversation with itself about this work. And Tom Brackett, who works with emerging communities in our church, he came and spoke in our diocese. He said the biggest barrier to the flourishing of these communities is the bishop. And I'm thankful he felt free to say it while I was sitting there in a room of 100 people, which was great. But I took that to heart, and I mean, part of our role is to create. I find defending the faith is really about creating safe space for as many people as possible, right? So the institution has to function and be available to as many people as possible, and yet we have to have a conversation among ourselves about some of these questions, like how do we let go? How do we let those spaces in? How do we continue to create safe space that is expansive and not shutting down? So, and I think that's a critical that's a developmental piece for us. Like you talk about the other communities of like, what do we do when we're growing and we're big? This is one of our growing edges and our developmental edges. So, yeah, there's a million great questions here. This is just rich. People will be so glad they came for everybody else's input. So you talk.
Well, I just want to say, I think it starts with this. I think it starts with making space where we can say things that maybe we couldn't say somewhere else within the church space. And often those spaces are created when we're in an unusual collaboration or we're in an unusual place. And in some ways, this COVID moment, of course, has forced everyone to do things differently. And so in some ways, this is the time to have these conversations, to dream and to be bold. There's a couple of things that came through in these questions that I really want to lift up. One of them mentioned reparations, and we're doing some work in the Methodist world at the moment. And absolutely at the center, before really the church can do anything else, I think it has to reckon with race internally in terms of noticing where white supremacy is tied up with the institution, and also offering spaces of healing and reparations for communities of color, particularly Americans who have descended from slaves, people who were enslaved. So I'm just so glad someone mentioned that, because I think it's absolutely at the heart of part of that process of regaining trust, is that we have to do what we say, and so if our work is love and justice, then that has to be at the heart of that. So I really appreciate that. I loved the question about elders. For me, this is one of the little hidden secrets in this conversation that just unlocks things. So often the people, and you'll have to tell me, Mary, if I'm off here, but as people gain authority within the institution, they also, whether intentionally or not, often take on the sense that they are responsible for its maintenance and success. And so although we might sometimes look to the center for leadership to do things really differently or really creatively, it gets harder and harder to do that the more seniority you have. And so that's why you were pointing us towards the edges to look at where creativity happens. But I think we can also look to the Catholic world for some really interesting ideas, because it is no surprise to me that the people who got this sense of transformation at the deepest level are our Catholic sisters, because as women in the Catholic Church, they have never been given power. And so they also did not have to maintain the same sense of maintenance. That was never part of their job as sisters. And so the most radical, the most creative kind of leadership for me has come from women religious. One project that people might like to learn more about is a project called Nuns and Nuns, where Catholic sisters are getting together with millennial unaffiliated people in conversation about spirituality, community, justice. And it has just led to some of the most beautiful experiments. And so that's a great example of those unlikely partnerships leading to new opportunities. And it is often for younger people who are looking for wisdom and what to make of life, the most beautiful gift sometimes that religious people can offer is just the offer of witness and accompaniment. And I think that's something that elders are in a beautiful position to do. They don't have to fix anything. They don't have to fundraise. They don't have to do anything. But what they can do is be a loving witness, a presence of encouragement, a word of faith, a sweetness, and an accountability perhaps. But that gift of witness is some of the most wonderful things that we can share with some of these leaders in third spaces.
It's the contagion of hope that is in the practice of our daily lives in the grocery store and
that's right.
In all the other spaces where to offer that word of hope. I moved back to the South from California, and one of the things that I love about living, I'm actually from Miami, so the Caribbean context and Southern context are all high context cultures, right? So relationships are really key. And when I was looking at moving back here, I thought, okay, you're going to have to build time into your schedule to stop and chat, and receive and give those kinds of witnesses or words of encouragement. And one of the ones I love is that people often will end a conversation with, have a blessed day, or, how are you? And the response to how are you is I'm blessed. And it's like, okay, so these little bonding exchanges that are beyond yourselves or the transaction of the moment that begin to characterize and deepen an identity of a community that doesn't have the barriers of church and not church, or this space and that space.
Yes.
And we can do that. We actually believe in this ridiculous stuff. We believe in this intangible
it's orthodoxy.
Stuff you can't see. That's all around us in the universe. Yeah. And I find having served in Silicon Valley, which is a highly structured, it's a company town, loads of engineers. But when you talk about concepts of energy, it's a real translation point of when I say, when we talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we're actually just saying energy is moving from one context to another, and people just go, okay, I got that, So, and that's what happens when we mix ourselves up. Yeah.
Absolutely. I would love, Mary, if you would share just a word or two more about that work that you did, kind of surrounded by these enormous tech firms, because those are some of the places that in our work have been the most hungry for conversations around beauty, justice, meaning, and especially, of course, that the kind of mindfulness wave in some ways started in California and has now spread across. And, there are all of these apps being developed, which are kind of trying to capture a spiritual practice and offering it. How did you see that kind of conversation, or how did you have those conversations between people in these kind of very secular spaces of tech companies, but who were coming to you or finding you in conversation and really something clicking?
Yeah, I think, we had lots of people who worked in those contexts in our congregation. So those conversations were right there. I think, Silicon Valley is a very stressful, production-driven place. Google, the early Google employees have numbers, right? I'm number 52, I'm number,
Yeah.
And I remember talking to one person who wasn't actually a church person, but he said, when we went from having to produce something from 24 months to 12 months, I just couldn't do it anymore. Right? So that, the engine is incredible. And the culture is tight, it's really tight. So what I found was that they just, because they're innovators, even, as engineers, they're always looking for the schematic of how it's going to work. So those places have created their own spaces, right? So, Google, Apple, Yahoo, all of them they often have chaplains, and they have, the Muslim gathering space at noon on Wednesday and the Christian one on Thursday and so on. So I haven't had to, I've walked alongside as they have innovated, and their clergy certainly did. I was the bishop over 45 churches, so they all had local congregations, and those congregations responded to those things. And, one other example is that the rate of autism is really high in the Valley. A lot of engineers are often autistic or somewhere on the spectrum, so their kids are. So one of our churches there had their youth director had special skills in working with autistic kids, because that's who went to church there,
Right.
So just meeting folks where they were in the space, but also being, the members of churches were in those spaces. So they were the witness, or the ministers, or the creators of the third spaces where they were spending their time. Yeah. And again, the church in that setting, I'm just thinking in Palo Alto, which All Saints Church there is right off University. You know, it's half a block from the Apple store there, and right around the corner from Stanford. And Sunday morning, you know, venture capitalists in the pew next to homeless people. And that's the kind of thing that church can do, right?
Yes.
Because everybody
Yes.
can walk in the door and be gathered around that altar. In that case, it's an altar in the center. And so you see each other living in that setting across from each other. And it is powerful.
That's one of the great gifts, I think, of congregations, and one I hope that continues and multiplies. I'm conscious that we're at time, and I'm sure folks have their next sessions that they want to go to, but I just want to say thank you, Mary, for accepting this invitation to be my conversation partner today. Adam and Michael, everyone involved in the logistics, and most importantly, all of you. It was just I was so touched by those beautiful questions, and I really hope this has stimulated your imagination for what's possible in your context. So thanks for being with us this morning.
Thank you, everybody. Bless you.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Casper. I'm so glad to have met you and to have had this opportunity to work with you.
Absolutely. May it continue. I look forward to finding another way to connect. Absolutely.
Yeah, I can't wait. Is Adam coming back to us? I hope.
There he is. Yes.